My task today is to give you a little bit of a picture about what ANDE's strategy looks like going forward and how this conference is going to play an important role in pushing that agenda ahead. So as was mentioned, my name is Devin Chesney. I've been with ANDE for 7 years. And I think one of the questions that's always been in the back of my mind as I think about our work is this one. I'm a big believer in entrepreneurship for development. I've been, pushing this. I've served as a social entrepreneur myself. I've founded 3 companies. And I've always wondered why this is the case. 1.7% of official development assistance goes through entrepreneurial means to achieving impacts in the more than $200 billion a year development assistance field. And the issue there, we don't often think about the underlying assumptions that international development brings to this work. I think we all understand that what we're trying to do is bring prosperity to places where it is lacking. But for some reason, the industry has evolved in such a way where the most direct path to impact, it seems obvious to us, if you want to sustain prosperity in a place, you need a job. And that job comes from a business. But very little of development is going directly to the most obvious path to create sustainable prosperity going forward. And I think the reason why is embedded in the history of the field. And so I want to talk a little bit about where I think things went wrong and what that means for us going forward. So it's a bit of an unusual place to begin talking about international development, but Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944, there was a very important UN gathering of about 44 nations in the late stages of World War II that gathered to discuss the economic cooperation necessary to rebuild Europe and the damage the war had done, and hopefully to also create more cooperative international system that would prevent the emergence of a similar conflict in the future. So the rebuilding of Europe by these efforts of the Marshall Plan was a massive success. It very quickly led to an emergence of prosperous economies in Europe, and those countries very quickly became net donors of funds to other economies to help in their recovery from the war. As a result, political opinion in the United States very quickly made grant-funding European economies untenable, and so all of the institutions that were created for that purpose shifted their focus to think about poverty alleviation around the rest of the world. Those efforts would eventually coalesce in the creation of USAID in 1961. Today, most high-income countries have their own development agency, and many of these institutions derived their founding mandate from the experience of rebuilding Europe post-World War II. Now, why do I spend so much time on this? Well, the reason this matters is because the focus of where development money is spent, still today, is acting like it is rebuilding the ruins of a civil society so that an economy might emerge from the ashes of war, as it did in Europe, rather than focus on building economic infrastructure that Europe already had in place from centuries of economic growth, but the lower income nations that we want to help with development assistance do not. So this chart is a split of where official development assistance gets spent across the world and how it has changed over time. And as you can see, the biggest categories are all public provision of social services. Things like healthcare systems, education, water, sanitation, agriculture, and humanitarian relief. In fact, the vast majority of assistance to low-income countries falls into one of these categories. And while supporting all of these things are certainly helpful to address human suffering in one form or another, these are all efforts at minimizing the symptoms of poverty rather than addressing its root causes. The OECD, which is, as I mentioned, was also an institution created during this post-war period, does not even track small business in the data set that comes from this. And so it's very difficult to even get good numbers about how much money is spent in our sector, which gives you some impression of how much that was an afterthought in this sector at the time of its creation. So this is a little bit about the problem. Before I shift to talking about the potential solution, I want to talk about where ANDE came from, and a little bit about how my own story intersects with this and why I'm so passionate about it. So Aspen, Colorado, the Aspen Institute was founded in a tent, much like this one, in 1949. At the time, the town of Aspen, Colorado was a mostly abandoned mining town, but a very beautiful setting. And among the motivations for its founding was a desire for reflection on the underlying values of society and culture. As its founder, Walter Papke, put it, the Aspen Institute is here to help a leader gain access to his or her own humanity by becoming more self-aware, more self-correcting, and more self-fulfilling. It was not hard to see the influence that World War II had on the creation of this institution that might prevent similar horrors from repeating in the future by encouraging leaders to be thoughtful about the decisions that they make and the values that motivate them. Interestingly, other than this meeting that happened annually for the first few years, one of the first formal programs of the Institute was the Aspen Seminar Series, which was very unique at the time for targeting business leaders to come together to talk about the way that values impact their conducting of business. This was, in the US at least, one of the first times that ideas that would later be the seeds of impact investing, social business, and social enterprise would become part of the public discourse. So the Institute would evolve and grow over the years, and by 2009, the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs was born. At the time, we were, and still are, one of more than 30 programs at the Aspen Institute aimed at collaborative action to solve the greatest challenges of our time. So we've come a long ways in terms of design and production. This was the original logo of the program, which I believe was done on Microsoft Paint on someone's computer. But I want to go back a little bit before this because that is when my own journey started into this field and would eventually lead me here to ANDE. And it has some interesting connections to the work that we do today. So just to give you a little bit of personal background on me, one of the things that informs my perspective in this work quite a lot, and that might not be obvious from looking at me, is that I grew up in poverty, at least the American version of it. So my father passed away when I was very young, and I am the oldest of 3 children, and my mother was left to raise the 3 of us and care for my elderly grandmother. We grew up in a mostly Mexican immigrant neighborhood of Houston, Texas. I was one of the only gringos, or white people, in most of my classes, which taught me a very necessary set of intercultural skills and at least enough Spanish to know when people were upset with me. But I think one of the things I believe as a result is that while the physical conditions of poverty are very different depending on the context, the social experience of poverty is a much more shared experience across a number of different contexts. Understanding what it's like to be on the bottom of a power dynamic and the lowered expectations and the negative assumptions that people make about you along the way form a powerful set of experiences that shape the way you see the world, I think, for the rest of your life. And it's those experiences, I believe, that while they are oftentimes unfortunate, they combine to form a worldview that makes people living in poverty some of the most resourceful and determined people on earth. I have been very fortunate to have been given some generous chances and lucky breaks along the way that helped me realize my potential. But many millions of people around the world have a far less kind experience. So my own story has made me feel a very deep connection and kinship with people who innovate and create because they have no other choices. And as a founder of 3 companies myself, I believe that entrepreneurship is one of the best tools for empowering this underestimated talent to realize its potential. So fast forward to 2006, and I was living in Chicago, working for a local nonprofit, not quite sure what I wanted to do with my career. And I read a book called The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs. This is him standing next to Bono, the singer of U2, who he would later collaborate with on a number of initiatives. And that book captured my imagination. And what mostly impressed me about it was Sachs's unapologetic ambition for the world's poor people. He had a thesis that if we just invest more ambitiously in solving all the various ailments that accompany poverty, that we could unlock what he called poverty traps, and that people would realize their potential and in the process escape poverty and overcome it. Now, in a funny twist of fate, that book inspired me to go to graduate school and study political economy of development, but it also inspired one of the most high-profile failures in development history. So the Millennium Villages Project was the culmination of Sachs' ideas to test them and see whether if you raised enough money and you built enough programs that coordinated together to solve all of these symptoms of poverty at the same time, whether poverty would cease. and it largely failed. You can see here they picked a bunch of different villages across different settings in Africa. They intentionally tried to get a lot of geographic and agricultural variability to see how it would fare in different settings. On all of the various human development indicators that it measured, it succeeded on technically 1/3 of them, which were mostly things like provision of healthcare services, which is success just by delivery. But on the factor of poverty alleviation, no effect was found across any of these settings. So I think just as in entrepreneurship, you actually often learn more from complete failure than middling success. And there was a key missing piece of the Millennium Villages projects that seems obvious to me today, looking back on it. But at the time, it was not a common thought to think about the way business should play a part in development objectives. Reflecting on the project in 2015, Jeffrey Sachs wrote this: "Rural poverty will not end without the rapid growth of urban job opportunities alongside the higher productivity and incomes of farm households." The Millennium Villages project was a test case whether the best case scenario of the way development is done today would actually eliminate poverty, and it very clearly wasn't. But what was missing was obvious before it even began. In rural villages, you need businesses to employ people and provide incomes. They're probably going to be very small, but you need to help them, and you might need to help foster the creation of new ones. And then they need to grow. Small and growing businesses. Sounds familiar to me for some reason. Back in ANDE's earliest days, which was a similar time to this period when this project was finally being acknowledged as a failure, it was clear to us that fostering the small and growing business ecosystem around the world was primarily done through something like business acceleration. It was a relatively new thing that was exploding all over the world, and one of the important questions we asked ourselves was, does this work, and is it cost effective? So ANDE launched the GALI initiative, the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative, which was our most ambitious research project to date. It was a partnership with Emory University that eventually produced a data set of more than 23,000 entrepreneurs that applied to an accelerator program around the world. They tracked both the accepted and the rejected companies to see the effect of acceleration on their progress. And there were a lot of insights from this work, but the biggest was perhaps that most accelerators have a positive ROI, but 80% of the impact on economic growth that is produced by accelerators is produced by the top quarter of performers. There is something special about the way a certain set of practitioners do this work that is vastly more impactful than the average. Eventually, we were able to distill some principles that seem to correlate with the high performers and those effective programs. But what we needed to know was not just what does a successful program look like, but can you teach someone those principles and make them more successful? So we took this data, and luckily for us, the Argidius Foundation is an active ANDE member and has been since our inception. They do almost exclusively this kind of grant making to BDS providers, and they took these principles and ran a multi-million-dollar experiment on the majority of their grant making portfolio for several years. They aligned each of their recipients with these principles, now called the SCALE principles, which is this acronym that are the 5 leading lessons that are important to keep in mind to be more effective. And what they found was tremendous. Their own grant-making portfolio had its return on investment go from 1.5 times the money they invested to 8 times the money they invested. And some of those performers were getting as high as 10 or 12 times return on investment. That means that the results of that experiment show that BDS services are among the best value for money interventions that we know of. The most effective intervention international development has ever figured out, and that they can be taught to people who don't already know them. So, I want to return to my original question. Why do small and growing businesses get so little of the more than $200 billion a year in development assistance, and how do we fix it? Well, I would answer this with a question. If you were a donor, and I could sell you $10 worth of durable and sustainable economic growth in a low-income place for $1 in grant money, how much of it would you buy? I think the answer is you'd buy quite a lot more than 1.7% of your budget. So thanks to the work that all of us have been doing together over the last 15 years, this is no longer a hypothetical question. It's one we're ready to pose to the development world. The global development institutions that were originally conceived to rebuild the social infrastructure of war-torn countries are still not adequately oriented towards the building of non-existent markets in the places that still suffer from extreme poverty. Economies, as it turns out, do not emerge from the ground naturally when the social conditions are right, but they must be cultivated intentionally by the kinds of work that ANDE members do every day. So we're reflecting on ANDE's past successes and strengths and the changes we would like to see in the development landscape going forward. We believe that our updated strategy will target two promising developments in the sector that align with our strengths and our value proposition. Those are evidence-based development and localization. So the ANDE strategy framework is really simple. For those of you who may remember the previous strategy, it was a 3x3 matrix that had 9 boxes and lots of very complicated things, and I'm sure everyone who saw that presentation forgot most of it the moment we were done. So I only have 2 points. On evidence-based development, what we are trying to do is make our members exceptional at building better entrepreneurs and higher growth ventures through evidence-based practices. We know a lot about what makes the interaction between an ANDE member organization and the entrepreneurs that they serve effective and impactful. And the fact that the difference in impact between an average performing ESO and a high performing one is up to 8 times higher growth for the businesses they serve means that it's an imperative that we invest in becoming a community for organizations who want to be this high performing or who already are and want to grow the field of practitioners who can do it this well. Everything that we do will have this micro lens focused on how we make the interaction between ESOs and entrepreneurs so effective that their contribution to accelerating an end to global poverty and its associated ills are undeniable. And similar to ending poverty, creating gender equality, or building a nature-positive and low-carbon economy, the only reason that you should use entrepreneurship and SGBs as a tool is because you need growth and scale. High-growth ventures are what will enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and without them, we have very little chance because there isn't enough money in the world in public or philanthropic pockets to do this without the private sector. So, if we can equip all of you and hopefully many future ANDE members to come with the measurement, tools, knowledge, and support of a world-class community of practitioners seeking extraordinary impact, and we demonstrate that the work you're doing can be taken to ever-increasing scale, we can begin to demand a seat at the table of development policy and position small and growing business support as a key mechanism for a modern, evidence-based, and locally oriented development sector. Secondly, on the localization point, we hear a lot about that these days. We also know that many of the donors speaking it the loudest are not doing the best job of living into it. And I think part of that is the fact that the old development paradigm is very hard to localize. It's very hard to take a grant-funded, externally imposed set of supports and make them self-sustain. But small and growing businesses are very easy to localize. In fact, we have a very natural path towards that. So as we unlock these new resources with this evidence-based approach, we can work together to build more vibrant local ecosystems that are driven by local institutions who create accessible pathways for entrepreneurs to access the support they need to grow. One thing that I'm really passionate about is we must ensure that entrepreneurship is not just an elite activity, where a single entrepreneur is given a microphone and a stage to scale a single impactful intervention. That is not a path to economic inclusion or self-sustaining broad-based economic growth. Instead, we have to push for a sophisticated vision of ecosystem-oriented investment that builds institutions' capacity to serve not just a single venture, but to organize talent and accumulate the capacity to serve an entire ecosystem that will benefit hundreds or thousands of entrepreneurs to come, most of whom will never speak on a conference circuit stage, but will get what they need to build the future of their choosing. So this is the dream, and this is what we want to work with each of you to plot a course towards to push this work forward in every context where ANDE is present. And to give you a sense of what success might look like and the scale we could be talking about, I want to give you a couple of examples. So the Indian ecosystem is fairly unique in that there is a new law in India that requires public corporates to invest 2% of their net corporate profits into a social cause. If we were able to position SGB support as a social pillar of strengthening the Indian economy and achieving all kinds of impact objectives along the way, we might expect that perhaps an amount half that size could be captured to high-performing BDS provider. And we help those providers grow in scale and capacity. The impact that that would achieve over a 10-year period would equate to $650 billion in GDP growth for India, due to the compound growth and the high returns from those resources being reinvested in the SGB ecosystem. Now that's a pretty big number, $650 billion. It's 3 times the official development assistance to the entire world by every country. But let's think about an even bigger number. If you look at the African context, all African nations combined receive about $60 billion of official development assistance. And as we know, only about 1.7% of that total goes to entrepreneurship support. If we could make high-performing BDS services the norm across the African continent and perhaps increase that investment from 1.7% just to 8%, that would represent a scaling of our sector by 5 times. I want you to think for a moment what 5 times larger, better funded sector would look like for you and your work. But the impact that that would have on the growth of the economies across Africa is in 10 years there would be a 61% higher GDP on average than there would otherwise be. 61%. That's an incredible difference that would actually start to put the international development as an endeavor out of business, because the growth that is created would be so exceptional. So, I think it's time for the ANDE network and the SGB ecosystem worldwide to transition. We've been around for 15 years. We started off as a nascent movement. At the time, the concepts of social enterprise were just emerging, impact investing was being formed as a field, and acceleration and incubation were new interventions that the world was still figuring out and coming to grips with. But today, we deserve a seat at the table to be an established pillar of development. We are already seeing BDS providers scaling worldwide, increasing their impact and scope. We're seeing thriving locally owned and operated ecosystems start to emerge as the norm. And I am hopeful that we will start to see small and growing business as a driver of a new development paradigm, one that is more evidence-based, more locally oriented, and frankly, more effective. So how do we get there? There's a few things I think are immediately clear. One is that measurement is at the core of all of this. Every ANDE member who is implementing programs with entrepreneurs needs to know their impact metrics and use them to guide how they make decisions about their programs going forward. We already have a few different ways of doing this. We run an ANDE metrics conference that rotates around the world every 9 months to a year. We hope every one of you will send someone on your team who leads the measurement of your impact to that conference. We have peer learning communities operated by our chapters in various contexts, and we always offer one-on-one support to any member who needs a consultation on how to do metrics more rigorously in your organization. We're excited to do more, so if you have ideas, we're very eager to hear them. We want this to be one of the key ways that we help unlock a bigger, stronger sector, because if you can't measure rigorously, you will have a hard time pulling larger and larger resources into the work that you do from the donors that we are trying to bring to the table. The second thing is we want to do bigger things together. ANDE is a really big platform. We have members in almost every country on earth, and we also have the Aspen Institute at our backs, which is quite a substantial institution that has a more than $250 million a year budget. We would like to use that platform to help you all scale the work that you do. So this could look like a lot of different things, but ecosystem building initiatives, we've got a few going on already, and we'd like to do more. Regranting facilities that help take very large pools of money and channel it into the most impactful work ANDE members are doing. And institutional capacity building. We want locally headquartered organizations to start to grow and scale and take more prominent role in their own ecosystems. And anything we can do to help facilitate that, we're more than happy to talk about it. And finally, we need to grow the small and growing business champions. I think there are many thousands of organizations around the world supporting SGBs in some fashion or another, But this needs to be a community that people are desperate to be a part of, one that is collaborative and impactful and helps everyone who is part of it become better at what they do. So, a couple of things that look different at ANDE that I think are worth pointing out as we work to achieve this mission. We have new global leadership. You've already met two of our regional directors. There's a third, Sucharita Kamath, who's in the audience as well, standing at the back and waving. She is our Asia regional director. I'm super excited to have a truly global ANDE leadership team for the first time. We have a senior leadership team that reflects all of the regions that we work in, and it is going to change the way that we make decisions, that we strategize, and that we collaborate with members, and I'm really excited about that development. The second is a unified global advisory structure, which I mentioned a bit at the beginning, but we are in the process of redesigning the way our steering committees work so that there will be an integration between the regional steering committees and our global advisory bodies in the form of a chair for each of those regional steering committees having a guaranteed seat on our global advisory committee. That will probably finally be worked out by January, but we are excited about that development as well. The DC office is actually rethinking its role to be function more like a global chapter and essential services broker. So we help provide the accounting and communications and the basic services to run an organization, and we serve the subset of members that are not based in one of our chapters, which there still are quite a lot of. But the team there has frankly shrunk quite significantly. When I started at ANDE, there were 22 people based in DC. Today there are 12, and we don't have any intention of that getting bigger again. From now on, we want to invest much more intentionally in leadership in the regions that we're trying to serve. And going forward, there will be a big emphasis on unlocking money with evidence. We are going to get more aggressive as an organization in saying, the evidence is clear, you should do this, and we would like to help you do it if you don't already know how. So hopefully there will be a number of big initiatives to come on that front. So, this brings us to the conference and what we hope we'll achieve over the next couple of days. I think that if we want to achieve these big ideas for small businesses, that is the theme of our time together, we have to be willing to ask ourselves some big questions. So a few of them that I would encourage you to keep in mind as you navigate this week, as you have conversations, as you feel new sources of inspiration. Do I really know how effective my organization is? That's a key question. How confident are you that the measurements is already in place to know where you sit on that impact spectrum? Are you an average performer or are you in that top quarter? And if you're not sure, we can help you get there. And if you are sure and you are on that top end of performers, how can you help teach more people to do what you do? So we hope you will give as much as you get and help grow the sector for the good of us all. The second thing is to think about how do we grow the pie together rather than fighting for a bigger slice. This is a really important one. I think we all, there are many leaders of many organizations in this room, and we're all thinking about how do we pay the bills, how do we get the next grant in the door. But we should also have a lens as much as possible to think about how do we collaborate and draw resources into this sector that wouldn't have otherwise been there. That is a big focus for ANDE in our thinking. And it is a place where we're more willing to take risks and to do things that are a little outside the box if we think it will bring new money to the table that wouldn't have otherwise been there. And finally, how do we collaborate to make the ecosystems that we inhabit stronger? How are we building the capital, the human capital, the social and economic capital to make sure that we leave our ecosystems in better shape with every intervention that we run? This is, I think, when you try to explain what developing a strong ecosystem is, at some level, it's just a human question of, do enough people in this ecosystem understand the tools of entrepreneurship sufficiently to do it well, and do they understand their market well enough to advise people well? And if you get a critical mass of those people, you will have a strong and vibrant ecosystem. So everybody should be thinking about all of their programs, the way in which they build the capacity of people who get it and people who know how to do this work well. So, those are a few things I hope you'll keep in mind over the next week. I want to share a little bit, just a final parting thought about how we think about this work and the ambitions that we have going forward. I think many people who come into this field at some point had a fairly ambitious or perhaps naive thought that what they want to do with their career is to change the world for the better. And I am very much a realist, pragmatist, and trying to be an optimist whenever I can. One of the practices that's been really helpful for me to think about the work that we do and the kinds of scale and ambition we want to have is every time I fly into a new city, whether it's Lagos, Nairobi, Abidjan, Jakarta, here in Bangkok, I like to look out the window and watch the little slice of the world go by. And as I do, I think about each street I see pass, each home, try to count the number of people you're looking at, think about the institutions that shape their lives, all of the weight of the status quo that is so substantial. And changing that is a really hard and sometimes arrogant thought. If you just think, I would like this place to be better, how can I do it? You should be immediately overwhelmed by the scale of what you're talking about there. But the thing that makes me an optimist about this work is the next question that I would ask myself, which is, who will help me? And I think where Jeffrey Sachs went wrong is that he didn't think he needed anyone to help him. He had these ideas in his head that he thought they were persuasive, and he raised a ton of money and was super persuasive about them. But he didn't recruit a team of people. He didn't have a network behind him. He didn't have the people on the ground on his side, and so he failed. I think one of the beautiful things about small and growing businesses as a tool for development is that there are two levels in which you can answer that question, who will help me? One is the ecosystem will help you. So if there isn't one there, it can be built. You can teach people how to do this. You can grow the number of actors who know how to do it well. And that ecosystem can have an impact where the sum is far greater than the parts. And secondly, the real people who do the work, the real people who will help you, look back out the window again. It's those people whose lives are affected by these conditions. And I think much of development condescends to people who experience poverty. It is imposing an external solution, and it is not asking them what they want for their lives, what their dreams are, or teaching them how to get it. I think that the true superiority of small and growing businesses as a tool is that the center of that conversation is what people want for their own lives, and all you're trying to do is equip them to realize those dreams. And in that paradigm, you don't have to design some brilliant scheme to solve all of people's problems and make their poverty seem less onerous. All you have to do is show them the tools and empower them to realize their own dreams. So, as you go about this week, I hope that you will think carefully about the size and the scale of the problems we're trying to address, but also think really carefully about that question, who will help me? If you look around this room, there's a lot of really amazing people who will help you, and each of these people represents dozens, maybe hundreds more people back in their organizations who will also help you, and I think there's a potential for a really powerful change among us. So, I thank you for taking the time, for coming and being with us for this week. I'm really excited about what is to come, and I look forward to meeting as many of you as possible. Thank you.